The year is 1944. A desperate lie becomes a sacred vow as a farm boy soldier risks everything for a woman his country calls the enemy. Their wedding bands glint in the candlelight of a prison camp chapel, the thunder of war rumbling in the distance. But when peace finally comes, their troubles have only just begun. Back home in Kansas, neighbors turn cold eyes toward the foreign bride. Bricks shatter windows, whispers cut like knives. Then comes the yellow telegram that threatens to tear them apart forever. The government claims their marriage is a fraud. Officials in polished shoes take her away. Train wheels screaming as they separate what God has joined. Across thousands of miles, a husband fights to reclaim his wife while a community must choose. Cling to old hatreds or find healing in the soil of forgiveness. When war divides a world, can love build a bridge strong enough to stand? And what happens when mercy takes root in the most unlikely ground? The morning sun beat down on the dirt yard of the prison camp. Sweat ran down Daniel Hayes' back as he stood in line with the other American soldiers. The air hung heavy with heat. No breeze moved through the tall grass beyond the fence. Daniel shifted in his boots and looked at the ground. He was just a farm boy from Kansas who never wanted to fight a war. Now he stood in a prison camp in the Philippines, watching terrible things happen that he couldn't stop. A sharp cry cut through the air. Daniel looked up. In the center of the yard, a young Japanese woman was tied to a wooden post. Her black hair fell across her face. Her nurse's uniform was torn at the back. "Who is she?" Daniel whispered to the soldier beside him. "Some Japanese nurse. They say she ain't fit to have babies. Her own people are punishing her." Daniel's stomach turned as a Japanese officer raised a whip. The first lash cut through the air with a terrible snap. The woman flinched but made no sound. Another lash fell, and another. The American guards stood watching, faces blank. They had been ordered not to interfere. Daniel couldn't bear to look. He turned his eyes to the ground, shame burning in his chest. This wasn't right. War or not, this wasn't right. When the punishment ended, the woman slumped against the post, barely conscious. The Japanese officer spat on the ground near her feet and walked away. As the crowd began to break up, Daniel found himself stepping forward. His legs moved without his mind telling them to. He unhooked his canteen from his belt and walked toward the post. "Hayes," hissed his sergeant, "get back in line." Daniel pretended not to hear. He knelt beside the woman and held out his canteen. "Water?" he said softly. She lifted her head. Her eyes met his, dark as night and filled with pain, but something else too. Something that hadn't been beaten out of her. She took the canteen with trembling hands. Their fingers brushed. Enemy and enemy, separated by war but joined in a moment of kindness. That afternoon, Daniel stood guard outside the infirmary tent. The camp hummed with the usual sounds, men talking, metal clanking, orders being shouted. But all Daniel could think about was the woman at the post. When the head nurse stepped out to get more supplies, Daniel slipped inside the tent. The air smelled of antiseptic and sickness. Rows of beds lined the walls. He found her in the corner, curled on her side, her back a mess of angry red welts. Her eyes were closed, her face flushed with fever. Daniel took a deep breath and tore a strip from his undershirt. He dipped it in a basin of clean water and gently placed it across her wounds. She gasped, and her eyes flew open. When she saw Daniel, fear flickered across her face. "It's okay," he whispered. "I'm just trying to help." Her eyes studied him, searching for the trick, the trap. Finally, she whispered one word. "Why?" Daniel thought about it. He wasn't sure himself. "Because someone ought to," he said at last. That night, rain fell on the camp, a slow, steady drizzle that washed the dust from the air. Daniel lay in his bunk, listening to the water hitting the roof. He'd hidden his torn undershirt from his sergeant. If they found out he'd helped a Japanese prisoner, he'd be in trouble. But as he drifted to sleep, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. The next morning, Daniel saw her again. She limped across the yard, carrying heavy buckets to the latrine. Her name, he learned, was Aiko. Later that day, while supervising repair work near the edge of camp, Daniel spotted something strange, a patch of green behind the waste trench. Curious, he moved closer. It was a tiny garden, hidden from view. Small plants grew in neat rows, their leaves bright against the brown earth. A sound made him turn. Aiko stood a few feet away, watching him warily. "You made this?" Daniel asked, pointing to the garden. She nodded slowly. "What are they?" he asked. "Medicine," she said. Her English was halting but clear. "For fever, for pain." Daniel looked at the garden with new respect. Even here, surrounded by barbed wire and guards, she had found a way to help others. "Need better dirt," Aiko said, touching the hard ground. "These not grow well." That evening, Daniel sneaked a rusty trowel and a bag of rich soil from the supply tent. He left them by her garden, hidden under a piece of cloth. When he returned to his barracks, Sergeant Miller was waiting. "You missed roll call, Hayes," Miller said, his eyes narrow. "What were you doing?" "Just needed some air, Sarge," Daniel said. Miller leaned close. "You start pitying them, you'll end up one of them. Remember which side you're on, boy." Daniel nodded, but in his heart, he was beginning to wonder if there were only two sides in this war. 2 nights later, panic spread through the camp. Men were falling ill, both prisoners and guards. The camp doctor diagnosed cholera. Without proper medicine, many would die. When Aiko stepped forward and offered to help, using her knowledge of herbal remedies, the American commander reluctantly agreed. They were desperate. Daniel volunteered to assist. He boiled bandages, carried water, and helped move the sick to the infirmary tent. Hour after hour, Aiko worked without rest. Her hands moved with steady skill as she made poultices from her garden herbs and mixed them with what little medicine the camp had. Daniel watched in awe as she tended to everyone, Japanese and American alike. She showed no hatred, no bitterness, only compassion. When an American officer began to recover after Aiko's treatment, the camp commander allowed her to stay in the infirmary permanently. At dawn, after a long night of work, Daniel sat outside the infirmary tent. The sun rose over the palm trees, painting the sky pink and gold. Aiko stepped outside, exhaustion written on her face. "Thank you, Daniel," she said softly. It was the first time she had spoken his name. Something warm unfurled in his chest. "You're welcome, Aiko." For 2 weeks, a fragile peace settled over the camp. The outbreaks slowly faded. Fewer men died each day. Daniel spent his free time helping in the infirmary, learning the names of Aiko's herbs, listening to her speak of her home in Japan. Then everything changed again. A jeep roared into camp, spraying dust. A tall officer stepped out, his uniform crisp despite the heat. Colonel Bragg had arrived to take command. "I won't have fraternization with the enemy," Bragg announced at his first inspection. His cold eyes fell on Aiko as she changed bandages on an American soldier. "Especially not that one." "Sir, she's been treating our men," the camp doctor protested. "She's saved lives." "She's a moral risk," Bragg said. "I want her transferred north for interrogation, immediately." Daniel stepped forward. "Sir, She's been essential to the medical team. Did I ask for your opinion, Corporal? Bragg's voice cut like a knife. No, sir. She leaves in 48 hours. That's final. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He sat outside the barracks, rolling his mother's wedding ring between his fingers. The gold caught the moonlight. He had carried it all through the war, a reminder of home. Across the yard, he could see the light of a single candle in the infirmary window. Aiko was praying, her shadow moving on the canvas wall. Daniel knew what would happen if she was sent north. The interrogators were brutal. She wouldn't survive. He had to do something. At morning roll call, Daniel stood straight as Colonel Bragg read out the day's orders. When Aiko was brought out to be prepared for transfer, Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs. Now or never. He stepped forward. Sir, there's been a mistake. Bragg's eyebrows rose. What mistake, Corporal? Daniel swallowed hard. Sir, this woman can't be transferred. She's my lawful wife under emergency field marriage code. A shocked silence fell over the yard. Every face turned to Daniel. What did you say? Bragg's voice was dangerously quiet. We were married during the outbreak, sir, by the chaplain. It's in the regulations. Prisoners who become family of U.S. personnel have protected status. Bragg's face darkened. You expect me to believe this story, Corporal? It's the truth, sir, Daniel said, meeting the colonel's gaze steadily. Check with Chaplain Wilson. He performed the ceremony. Bragg was silent for a long moment. You have 48 hours to provide proof of this marriage. Until then, both of you will be confined to quarters. If you're lying, Hayes, you'll face court-martial. Daniel and Aiko were escorted to a small storeroom. When the door closed behind them, Aiko looked at Daniel with wide eyes. Why you say that? She whispered. Daniel knelt beside her. To save you from being transferred. They'll hurt you if they take you north. But it's a lie. Yes, Daniel admitted. But maybe... He hesitated. Maybe it doesn't have to be. The next evening, Daniel and Aiko stood in the camp's half-destroyed chapel. Chaplain Wilson, an old man with kind eyes, looked troubled, but agreed to perform the ceremony after Daniel explained the situation. This isn't how marriages should begin, Wilson said. But these aren't normal times. The chapel was dim, lit by a few candles. Outside, rain began to fall, drumming on the broken roof. Daniel took his mother's ring from his pocket. Aiko's hand trembled as he slipped it onto her finger. It was too big, but she curled her fingers to keep it in place. Repeat after me, the chaplain said to Aiko. To have and to hold from this day forward. Aiko struggled with the English words, her voice soft but determined. To have and hold from this day. For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer. For better, Aiko repeated slowly. For worse, for rich, for poor. In sickness and in health, to love and to cherish. Aiko's eyes met Daniel's. In sickness, in health. She paused. To cherish, to forgive. Outside, soldiers snickered as they passed the chapel. Daniel ignored them. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Chaplain Wilson said quietly. Colonel Bragg, who had insisted on watching the ceremony, stamped the approval papers with obvious disgust. There, she's officially listed as wife of U.S. personnel. Satisfied, Corporal? Daniel nodded. Thank you, sir. As they walked back to the camp in the pouring rain, Daniel held his coat over Aiko's head to keep her dry. Inside the infirmary hut, she looked down at the gold band on her finger, wonder and confusion on her face. Thunder rolled across the sky. Daniel touched her hand gently. I promise to protect you, he said, for as long as this war lasts. Word spread through the camp like wildfire. By morning, everyone knew about Daniel and Aiko. His fellow soldiers called him Jap Lover behind his back. The Japanese prisoners avoided Aiko, seeing her as a traitor. But something was changing between them. They ate together in the corner of the mess hall, sharing a tin plate of rice. Aiko taught Daniel Japanese words. Words for thank you, for peace, for hope. Daniel found himself watching her hands as she worked, noticing the grace in her movements. She was no longer just someone he had helped on impulse. She was becoming someone he cared about. One evening, they sat together outside the infirmary. The camp radio crackled with news that Japan might soon surrender. The war that had brought them together might soon end. When this ends, Daniel said quietly, I'll take you home. Aiko didn't respond, but in the fading light, Daniel saw tears glimmer in her eyes. He reached out and took her hand. Enemy and enemy no longer. Just two people finding mercy in a merciless time. Rain fell softly as night came to the camp. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, they had found a moment of peace in the storm of war. The war ended with a distant rumble, like thunder over the horizon. Radios across the camp crackled with the news. Japan had surrendered. Men shouted and wept. Some danced. Others sat in stunned silence, wondering if they would ever really go home. For Daniel and Aiko, the end of the war brought a new kind of fear. What would happen to them now? They're dismantling the camp, Daniel told Aiko as they sat in the shade of a palm tree. Everyone's being shipped out. Americans home, Japanese. He didn't finish. Home for Japan's people was a country in ruins. Aiko twisted the gold ring on her finger. What about me? She asked softly. Daniel took her hand. You're my wife now, on paper and in my heart. Where I go, you go. 2 weeks later, they stood on the deck of a crowded hospital ship bound for San Francisco. The ocean stretched blue and endless around them. Aiko leaned against the railing, watching flying fish leap beside the hull. Free, she whispered, the wind catching her black hair. Daniel stood beside her, breathing in the salt air. He was going home, but would America welcome Aiko? His stomach knotted with worry. The American nurses on the ship kept their distance from Aiko. Some glared. Others pretended she wasn't there. Daniel stayed close, ready to defend her if needed. At night, they sat on the deck under the stars. Daniel told Aiko about Kansas, about the wheat fields that stretched like gold oceans, about his family's small farm, about the big sky that went on forever. It ain't much, he said. Just a little house and some land. Nothing like what you might be used to. Aiko shook her head. After prison camp, a safe place is enough. She paused. Will your family like me? Daniel hesitated. His parents were gone. His father from a heart attack, his mother from pneumonia. Only his sister Margaret remained on the farm. Margaret's got a good heart, he said at last. Might take her time to warm up to you is all. As they neared California's coast, a fog rolled in, hiding the land. The chaplain found Daniel on deck and took him aside. Son, I should warn you, the old man said, his voice low. U.S. immigration might not recognize your war marriage. They're being real strict about Japanese nationals. Daniel's jaw tightened. She's my wife. I'll fight for her right to stay. The chaplain nodded. Just be prepared. It won't be easy. San Francisco harbor bustled with ships and people. The Golden Gate Bridge loomed through the mist as their ship docked. Daniel and Aiko stood in line with other returning soldiers, waiting to disembark. When their turn came, immigration officers pulled them aside. Japanese national, one officer noted, eyeing Aiko suspiciously. Need to verify these papers. Hours passed in a small office that smelled of cigarettes and coffee. Daniel pleaded their case, showing their marriage certificate, explaining how Aiko had saved American lives in the camp. "Please," he said, his voice hoarse from talking. "She's got nowhere else to go." Finally, after consulting with superiors, the officer stamped Aiko's papers. "Temporary supervision," he said gruffly. "She can stay, but she's your responsibility. Any trouble, she gets sent back." Daniel let out the breath he'd been holding. "Thank you, sir." Outside, the air felt sweeter than any Daniel had breathed in years. He bought Aiko a chocolate bar from a street vendor, her first taste of American sweets. Her eyes widened as the rich flavor melted on her tongue. "Good?" Daniel asked, smiling at her expression. "Very good," she said, savoring each bite. They spent a week in San Francisco, waiting for the paperwork to be finalized. At night, they stayed in a cheap hotel near the docks. During the day, they walked the city streets. Aiko drew curious glances from passers-by. Sometimes people whispered. Once, a man spat on the sidewalk as they passed. Daniel's hand tightened around Aiko's. "Don't pay them no mind," he said. "They don't know you." Finally, they boarded a train bound east. The journey would take days, across mountains and deserts, through towns and cities, until they reached the plains of Kansas. They shared a small sleeper compartment. Through the window, Aiko watched America unfold, vast and beautiful and strange. She asked about everything: the tall pine trees, the red rock canyons, the wide rivers. "America is so big," she said, wonder in her voice. The train stopped at stations along the way. Each time, Daniel bought them food with his meager savings: sandwiches wrapped in paper, apples, bottles of soda pop. At night, when Aiko slept, Daniel watched her face in the dim light from the passing towns. Sometimes she cried out in her sleep, haunted by memories of the camp. He would gently touch her hand, and she would quiet, knowing she wasn't alone. After days of travel, the mountains gave way to rolling plains. Fields of wheat and corn stretched to the horizon. Daniel pressed his hand against the glass. "Almost home," he said. The train pulled into Topeka Station on a hot afternoon. Daniel and Aiko stepped onto the platform, carrying their few belongings in battered suitcases. The air smelled of dust and grass and summer. A bus took them as far as the county road. From there, they walked, following a dirt path through fields ready for harvest. The sun beat down on their backs. Aiko's shoes, worn thin from the camp, offered little protection against the rough ground. "Not much further," Daniel encouraged, though his own legs ached with fatigue. At last, they crested a small hill, and Daniel's heart skipped a beat. There it was, the farmhouse where he grew up. It looked smaller than he remembered, its white paint peeling, the porch sagging in one corner. But it was home. As they approached, the screen door creaked open. A woman stepped out, shielding her eyes against the sun. "Daniel," she called, her voice uncertain. "It's me, Maggie," Daniel answered, quickening his pace. Margaret Hayes was tall and thin, her brown hair pulled back in a severe bun. She ran down the steps and threw her arms around her brother, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know when you'd come," she sobbed. "Or if you'd come at all." "I'm here now," Daniel said, holding his sister tight. "I'm home." When they broke apart, Margaret noticed Aiko for the first time. She stiffened, her smile fading. "Who's this?" she asked, though the wary look in her eyes suggested she already knew. "This is Aiko," Daniel said, placing his hand on Aiko's shoulder. "My wife." Margaret's face paled. "Your wife?" she repeated. She stared at Aiko, taking in her worn clothes, her foreign features. "You brought one of them here?" "Maggie," Daniel began, but his sister had already turned and walked back into the house, the screen door slapping shut behind her. Daniel looked at Aiko, apology in his eyes. "She'll come around," he said, though he wasn't sure himself. "Let's go inside." The farmhouse was just as Daniel remembered. The wooden floors that creaked in certain spots, the faded curtains his mother had sewn, the old wood stove in the kitchen. But there was a layer of dust over everything, as if the house had been holding its breath, waiting. Margaret busied herself at the stove, her back to them. "I'll make supper," she said, her voice clipped. "You can show her where to put her things." Daniel led Aiko upstairs to his old bedroom. The single bed seemed too small for two people. A quilt his mother had made lay folded at the foot. "It ain't much," he said again. Aiko set down her suitcase and touched the quilt gently. "It is a home," she said. "Better than a camp." Supper that first night was a silent affair. Margaret set plates without speaking to Aiko. The food, fried potatoes, cornbread, and cold ham, sat heavy on the table between them. Daniel tried to make conversation. "Crop looks good this year." "It's been dry," Margaret replied, "and I can't manage it all alone." "I'm back now," Daniel said. "We can work it together." Margaret's eyes flicked to Aiko. "The neighbors will talk, you know, about her." "Let them talk," Daniel said, his voice firm. After dinner, Aiko quietly gathered the plates and began washing them in the sink. The sound of running water and clinking dishes filled the awkward silence. Daniel went outside to check the farm. The barn needed repair. The fence around the chicken coop was broken in places, and the fields were overgrown with weeds. His heart sank. There was so much work to do. Inside, Margaret watched Aiko from the doorway. "You don't have to do that," she said stiffly. Aiko glanced up. "I want to help," she said simply. That night, Daniel lay beside Aiko in his childhood bed. The sheets smelled of soap and dust. Through the open window came the sounds of crickets and distant coyotes. "You okay?" Daniel whispered. Aiko nodded in the darkness. "Your sister does not like me." "She's scared," Daniel said. "The war changed everybody. Give her time." Later, when Daniel had fallen asleep, Aiko slipped from the bed and knelt on the rough wooden floor. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer in Japanese, for peace, for acceptance, for this strange new home. At dawn, Daniel woke to find Aiko gone. Panic fluttered in his chest until he looked out the window and saw her kneeling in the garden behind the house, her hands buried in the soil. He dressed quickly and went outside. The morning air was cool, the grass wet with dew. "What are you doing?" he asked, approaching Aiko. She looked up, dirt streaking her face. "Testing soil," she said. "For garden, it is good soil. Rich." Daniel crouched beside her. "You want to plant a garden?" Aiko nodded. "In my country, we say soil remembers kindness. If we are kind to it, it gives back food, medicine. It is same everywhere." Something warm spread through Daniel's chest. "I reckon that's true." Over the next days, Aiko worked tirelessly in the garden. She mixed wood ashes with the clay to loosen it, built small irrigation channels from hollowed bamboo she found in a dry creek bed, and planted seeds she had carried all the way from the Philippines, herbs for healing, vegetables for eating. Daniel focused on repairing the farm, fixing fences, patching the barn roof, clearing irrigation ditches. Sometimes he caught Margaret watching Aiko from the kitchen window, her expression unreadable. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink, Daniel found Aiko watering her garden. New green shoots had already broken through the soil. How'd you make them grow so fast? He asked, amazed. Aiko smiled, a rare, full smile that lit up her face. I talk to them, she said. Plants like voices. Daniel laughed. What do you tell them? I tell them about you, Aiko said softly. About how you saved me? Daniel's laugh faded. He looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just duty anymore. This wasn't just a marriage of convenience or a promise made in wartime. This was something deeper. Aiko, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I need to tell you something. She waited, her dark eyes on his face. What I did, marrying you to keep you safe, it started as a duty, but now? He took a deep breath. Now I'm thinking maybe what we said in that chapel wasn't a lie after all. Aiko's eyes widened. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, slowly, she reached out and touched his cheek. I think same, she whispered. They sat on the porch steps as fireflies began to flicker in the gathering dusk. Aiko leaned her head against Daniel's shoulder. For the first time since the war ended, both felt a kind of peace. Summer faded into late August. The corn grew tall, the garden flourished, and slowly, life found a rhythm. Each morning, Daniel and Aiko worked side by side in the fields. At noon, they ate lunch under the shade of the old oak tree. In the evenings, they sat on the porch, watching the stars appear. Margaret kept her distance, but the open hostility had faded. Sometimes, she even asked Aiko to help with the canning or the laundry. One hot afternoon, as Daniel and Aiko worked in the north field, Aiko suddenly swayed and collapsed. Daniel dropped his hoe and ran to her, heart pounding. Aiko! He cried, gathering her in his arms. What's wrong? Her face was pale, her skin clammy. Dizzy, she murmured. Sorry. Daniel carried her back to the house, calling for Margaret. Together, they laid Aiko on the sofa and bathed her face with cool water. When she opened her eyes, there was fear in them. Daniel, she whispered, I must tell you something. Margaret quietly left the room, closing the door behind her. What is it? Daniel asked, kneeling beside the sofa. Are you sick? Aiko shook her head. Tears filled her eyes. In camp, before you came, Japanese doctors. She struggled to find the words. They make operation, so I cannot have babies. Daniel felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath him. They sterilized you? He asked, horror in his voice. Aiko nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. They say I am unfit, not pure enough. She covered her face with her hands. I understand if you want real wife someday. Wife who can give children. Daniel sat in silence, his heart breaking for her suffering. All the cruelty she had endured, all the pain, and still she thought of his happiness. Slowly, he took her hands from her face and held them in his. Aiko, he said firmly, look at me. She raised her tear-stained face. You are my real wife, Daniel said. I don't need children to love you. But your family name? Then this land will be our child, Daniel said, his own eyes filling with tears. We'll pour our love into it, watch it grow. That's enough for me. Aiko let out a sob and fell into his arms. They held each other, both crying, as the sun set through the window. Outside, Margaret stood on the porch, a basket of laundry in her arms. Through the open window, she had heard everything. For the first time, she saw Aiko not as an enemy, but as a woman who had suffered, who had lost her future, who loved her brother. Something hard in Margaret's heart began to soften. On Sunday morning, Daniel announced that they would all attend church. Aiko looked nervous, but she put on her best dress, a simple blue cotton, that Margaret had given her. The small country church stood on a hill overlooking the town. As Daniel, Iko, and Margaret walked up the steps, conversations stopped. All eyes turned to them. Inside, they sat in a pew near the back. Whispers rose around them. A few people moved to different seats, away from the Hayes family. Reverend Holt, a tall man with a stern face, took the pulpit. His sermon that day was on keeping faith pure. "We must be vigilant," he thundered, "against those who would corrupt our way of life, our very beliefs." His eyes seemed to linger on Iko as he spoke. Daniel's hand tightened around hers. After the service, as people gathered outside, Daniel overheard two men talking. "Heard Hayes brought back an enemy woman," one said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Disgrace to his uniform, if you ask me." Daniel's fists clenched. He started toward the men, anger boiling in his veins, but Iko caught his arm. "Please," she whispered. "Not here." Daniel took a deep breath and turned away. "Let's go home," he said. That night, as they prepared for bed, a crash shattered the quiet. Daniel rushed downstairs to find a brick on the kitchen floor, the window above it broken. A note was wrapped around the brick, held in place with string. Daniel unfolded it, his hands shaking. 2 words were scrawled in rough letters. "Send her back." Iko stood in the doorway, her face pale. Daniel quickly crumpled the note and threw it in the stove. "Just kids playing pranks," he lied, though they both knew better. He held Iko tight that night, promising that nothing would harm her. But as she slept, Daniel stared at the ceiling, worry gnawing at his gut. The town would never accept her. And without the town's help, how could they survive? September brought drought. The creek that ran through the farm slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. The corn began to wither in the fields. Dust rose with every footstep. Daniel trudged to town to speak with Reverend Holt's brother, who controlled the only working dam upstream. "We need water," Daniel said, hat in hand. "Just enough to save the crops." Tim Holt leaned against the dam controls, a smirk on his face. "Heard you got yourself a Jap wife," he said. "Reckon God's punishing you for mixing blood." Daniel's hand moved toward the revolver at his hip, a habit from the war. His fingers twitched with the urge to draw it. But then he remembered Iko's gentle touch, her quiet strength. Violence wasn't the answer. It never had been. "Please," Daniel said. "I'm asking as a neighbor." "Neighbors help their own kind," Holt spat. "Not enemy lovers." Daniel walked back to the farm empty-handed, his heart heavy. When he told Iko and Margaret what had happened, Margaret slammed her fist on the table. "Those self-righteous hypocrites!" she cried. "After all you did in the war, Daniel!" Daniel was surprised at his sister's outburst. It was the first time she had truly defended him, and by extension, Iko. As days passed, the drought worsened. The garden wilted despite Iko's careful rationing of well water. The corn shriveled in the fields. Even the old oak tree's leaves began to turn brown and fall. One morning, Daniel stood in the yard, looking up at the cloudless sky. "We need to dig a new well," he decided. "The old one's almost dry." For 3 days, Daniel dug in the spot where his father had once said water might be found, a low place near the edge of the property. The sun beat down mercilessly. His hands blistered and bled. Iko brought him water and food, bathed his raw palms with herbs to ease the pain. Margaret watched from the porch, convinced it was hopeless. "You'll dig to China before you find water," she said. But Daniel kept digging. On the 3rd day, as the hole reached deeper than he was tall, his spade struck something different, not the dry, hard clay they had seen for days, but darker, damper soil. "Aiko!" he called, excitement in his voice. "I think I found something!" Water seeped slowly into the bottom of the hole, muddy at first, then clearer. As Daniel worked, more water filled in. By evening, they had a new well, its water cool and sweet. The family gathered around it, laughing and crying with relief. Daniel filled buckets for Aiko's garden. Margaret ran to tell the nearest neighbors. That evening, as word spread, people from the village arrived asking for water. Their own wells had run dry weeks ago. Daniel stood at the edge of the yard, watching as Aiko filled bucket after bucket, giving water to all who asked, even those who had cursed her, who had thrown the brick, who had whispered behind her back. Margaret worked alongside her, passing full buckets down the line of waiting farmers. In the glow of lanterns hung from tree branches, the scene looked almost magical, like fireflies of peace lighting up the darkness, bringing hope where there had been only fear and hate. Fall came to Kansas like a painting come to life. The sky turned deep blue. Leaves on the old oak tree blazed orange and red. Mornings brought frost that melted under the gentle touch of the sun. After the miracle of the well, something changed in the town. People who had once crossed the street to avoid Aiko now nodded when they saw her. Some even smiled. The harvest was better than anyone expected, despite the drought. Aiko's garden gave more vegetables than the three of them could eat. She canned tomatoes and pickles, dried herbs that hung in bunches from the kitchen ceiling, and shared the bounty with neighbors. When the preacher's youngest child fell sick with fever, Aiko made a tea from her herbs and brought it to their door. Mrs. Holt took it with hesitation, doubt clear in her eyes. "It will help," Aiko promised. "Give 3 spoons each hour." 2 days later, the Reverend himself appeared at their farm. His hat was in his hands, his face solemn. "The child's fever broke," he said. "The doctor says it's a miracle?" Aiko bowed her head. "Not miracle, just old medicine." The Reverend looked at her differently then, as if really seeing her for the first time. "My wife is hosting a Thanksgiving supper next week, for the harvest. We'd be pleased if you would come." He cleared his throat. "All of you." "We'll be there," Daniel said, his arm around Aiko's shoulders. After the Reverend left, Margaret laughed out loud, a sound that had been rare since Daniel returned. "Well, I'll be," she said. "Looks like you're winning them over, Aiko." Aiko smiled, a flush of happiness on her cheeks. "What should I bring to supper?" "Mrs. Holt asked if you might make that rice pudding you fixed last week," Margaret said. "Said it was the best she ever tasted." Daniel watched the 2 women discussing recipes, joy filling his heart. His sister and his wife talking like family. It was more than he had dared hope for. The Thanksgiving supper was held in the church basement. Tables lined with white cloths groaned under the weight of food: roasted chickens, corn pudding, apple pies, and breads of every kind. When Daniel, Aiko, and Margaret arrived, a hush fell over the room. Daniel felt Aiko's hand tremble in his. Then Mrs. Holt stepped forward. "Aiko, dear, we saved a place for your rice pudding right here in the center." She guided Aiko to the dessert table. People began to talk again. Children ran between the tables, laughing. Someone played a fiddle in the corner. Before the meal, Reverend Holt asked for silence. "Let us bow our heads and give thanks," he said. "Thanks for the harvest, for the rain, and for new friends." His eyes met Aiko's across the room. God teaches us that strangers can become neighbors, and neighbors can become family. Let us remember that lesson today. Daniel squeezed Aiko's hand under the table. She smiled, tears shining in her eyes. After dinner, when everyone had eaten their fill, Reverend Holt asked Aiko to say a few words about her homeland. She stood shyly, her voice soft but clear, as she described the cherry blossoms in spring, the rice fields in summer, the autumn moon festivals. The children gathered close, entranced by her stories. Women nodded in recognition when Aiko spoke of mothers teaching daughters to cook, of gardens tended with care, of prayers for loved ones far away. "We are not so different," Aiko said, looking around the room. "American mothers, Japanese mothers, all want same thing: safe home, happy children, peace." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Daniel watched with pride as his wife, once feared as an enemy, touched the hearts of his neighbors with her simple words. As they walked home beneath a full moon, Daniel felt lighter than he had in years. The war seemed far away now. The future stretched before them, bright with promise. Then they saw the boy on horseback coming up the lane, a leather satchel at his side. His faded cap bore the Western Union logo. "Telegram for Mr. Hayes," the boy called, reining in his horse. Daniel's stomach dropped. Telegrams rarely brought good news. He took the yellow envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the words stark and official. "Regarding marriage license 4591, issued in Philippines, stop request presents for review, stop possible charges of falsification, stop report to Topeka Federal Office October 15th, stop." Daniel read it twice, his heart pounding. Aiko touched his arm. "What is it?" she asked, worry in her voice. He handed her the telegram. As she read, the color drained from her face. "What does it mean?" Margaret asked. "It means the government is questioning our marriage," Daniel said, his voice tight. "We have to go to Topeka to sort it out." "But it's legal now," Margaret protested. "You're really married. Everyone knows that." Daniel shook his head. "The original papers, the ones from the camp, they were based on a lie. I told them we were already married when we weren't." "So, what happens now?" Margaret asked. Daniel looked at Aiko, whose hands were shaking. "We go to Topeka," he said firmly. "We tell the truth, and we pray they understand why I did what I did." That night, no one slept well in the farmhouse. Daniel lay awake, Aiko curled against him, her breathing uneven. "I'm afraid," she whispered into the darkness. "I know," Daniel said, holding her close. "But I won't let them take you from me. I promise." The next morning, they packed small bags for the trip to Topeka. The train would leave at noon. Margaret stood in the kitchen, watching them prepare. She had changed since Daniel came home, her face softer, her manner less sharp. Now, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver locket. "Here," she said, pressing it into Aiko's hand. It was Mother's. It has her picture inside. Aiko opened the locket to see a faded photograph of a woman with kind eyes. Eyes that looked like Daniel's. "I can't take this," Aiko protested. "It's family treasure." Margaret closed Aiko's fingers around the locket. "You are family," she said quietly. "You belong here more than I thought." Aiko's eyes filled with tears. The two women embraced, the barriers between them finally broken. Daniel watched, his own throat tight with emotion. Then he picked up their bags. "Time to go," he said. They took the wagon into town, Margaret driving. At the station, Daniel helped Aiko down, then turned to his sister. "Take care of the farm," he said. "We'll be back soon." "You better be," Margaret replied, trying to smile through her worry. "The north field needs planting before the first frost." The train pulled into the station with a screech of brakes and a cloud of steam. Daniel and Aiko boarded, finding seats near the back. As the train pulled away, they watched Margaret grow smaller in the distance, her hand raised in farewell. Topeka was 3 hours away. Aiko sat quietly beside Daniel, the locket clutched in her hand. Daniel stared out the window, watching the familiar landscape roll by. Fields ready for winter, farmhouses with smoke curling from chimneys, cattle grazing in pastures. "Whatever happens," he said, taking Aiko's hand, "we face it together." The Topeka Federal Building stood tall and imposing, its stone steps leading to heavy wooden doors. Inside, clerks directed them to a small office on the third floor. A balding man with wire-rimmed glasses sat behind a desk piled with papers. "Hayes?" he said, looking up as they entered. "Daniel and Aiko?" He stumbled over her name. "Yes, sir," Daniel said, standing straight as if at attention. "I'm Mr. Simmons with Immigration Services," the man said. He shuffled through his papers. "We have some questions about your marriage documentation." For an hour he questioned them, when they met, how long they had known each other, who had performed the ceremony. Daniel answered honestly, explaining the circumstances of the camp, the threat of transfer, the choice he made to save Aiko's life. "So you admit the initial paperwork was falsified?" Simmons asked, his pen poised over a form. "Yes, sir," Daniel said. "But we were legally married after that, by Chaplain Wilson. And we've been living as husband and wife ever since." Simmons made a note. "Unfortunately, if the original application was fraudulent, the subsequent marriage may also be invalid, especially given Mrs. Hayes's status." "What does that mean?" Daniel asked, dread growing in his stomach. "It means," Simmons said, closing his folder, "that Mrs. Hayes will need to be detained for further questioning. Standard procedure for Japanese nationals with questionable documentation." "Detained?" Daniel's voice rose. "She's my wife." "That's what we're here to determine, Mr. Hayes." Simmons pressed a button on his desk. 2 officers appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Hayes will be transferred to California for processing. You are required to remain in Kansas pending investigation." "No!" Daniel stood, his chair scraping back. "You can't separate us." Aiko reached for his hand, her face pale but composed. "Daniel," she said softly, "don't make trouble." "This is wrong," Daniel insisted, looking from Simmons to the officers. "She saved American lives in that camp. She's been accepted by our community. She's my wife." Simmons sighed. "I understand this is difficult, Mr. Hayes, but the law is clear. If you interfere, you could face charges yourself." The officers moved forward. One took Aiko gently by the arm. "Ma'am, if you'll come with us." Daniel felt as if the floor was falling away beneath him. "When will she come back?" "That depends on the investigation," Simmons said. "Could be weeks, could be months." "Where are you taking her?" Daniel demanded. "San Pedro Detainment Center," one officer replied. "Near Los Angeles." Aiko stood, her small bag clutched in her hands. She looked at Daniel, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "I will be okay," she said. Daniel pulled her into a fierce embrace. "I'll come for you," he whispered. "I promise." The officers led Aiko from the room. Daniel watched helplessly as she was escorted down the hall. "Mr. Hayes," Simmons said, gathering his papers, "I suggest you return home and wait for notification. Interfering will only make things worse." But Daniel barely heard him. All he could think about was Aiko, alone, afraid, surrounded by strangers who saw her only as an enemy. That night, Daniel paced the small hotel room he had rented, unable to sleep. The walls seemed to close in around him. Outside, rain pattered against the window, as if the sky itself were weeping. He knew what he had to do. Waiting for the government to sort things out could take forever. Aiko needed him now. At dawn, Daniel returned to the farm. Margaret was hanging laundry when he arrived, alone. "Where's Aiko?" she asked, alarm in her voice. Daniel explained what had happened, his words tumbling out in a rush of anger and desperation. "They're sending her to California. I've got to go after her." Margaret's face paled. "But you don't have money for train fare all the way to California." "I'll find a way," Daniel said, already moving toward the barn. "I can sell the horse." "Daniel, wait." Margaret hurried after him. "You need to think this through. What's your plan when you get there?" Daniel stopped, his hand on the barn door. "I don't know yet, but I can't let her face this alone." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she went into the house and returned with a small tin box. "Here," she said, pressing it into his hands. "It's what's left of Father's savings. Not much, but enough for a train ticket." Daniel stared at the box, then at his sister. "Maggie, I can't take this." "Yes, you can." She pushed it firmly into his hands. "Bring her home, Daniel. Bring your wife home." The journey west was harder than Daniel expected. The train was crowded with returning soldiers, businessmen, and families heading to California for the winter. He could only afford a seat in the cheapest car, where he sat upright for days, sleeping in fits and starts. When his money ran low, he got off at Kansas City and found work loading freight for 3 days to earn enough for the next leg of the journey. In Denver, he shared meals with drifters who rode the rails, learning from them which cars were safest, which railroad bulls could be bribed, which towns offered work for a strong back. The journey took weeks instead of days. Fall deepened into early winter. The land changed around him. Flat plains giving way to mountains, then desert, then finally the green valleys of California. Through it all, Daniel held on to one thought. Aiko was waiting. He had promised to come for her. As the train approached Los Angeles, Daniel's heart beat faster. He was close now. So close. But when he finally reached the San Pedro Detainment Center, a low, gray building surrounded by chain-link fence, his hope turned to despair. "No visitors allowed," the guard at the gate told him. "Detainees are restricted from outside contact during processing." "My wife is in there," Daniel said, his voice rough from exhaustion. "Aiko Hayes. I need to see her." The guard shook his head. "Rules are rules, buddy. Come back when you've got proper authorization." Daniel argued until his throat was raw, but the guard wouldn't budge. Finally, as the sun began to set, Daniel walked away, defeat weighing on his shoulders. He found lodging at a small mission run by nuns near the port. Sister Maria, an elderly woman with kind eyes, gave him a cot in the back room and a bowl of thin soup. "Your wife is Japanese?" she asked, as Daniel explained his situation. He nodded. "We met in a prison camp in the Philippines. I was a guard, she was a prisoner. But she saved lives, American lives. She's a good woman." Sister Maria nodded thoughtfully. "One of our nurses volunteers at the detainment center. Perhaps she could help." Hope flickered in Daniel's chest. Could she take a message to Aiko? "I will ask," Sister Maria promised. The next day, the nun returned with a young woman named Clara. "I work in the medical ward at San Pedro," Clara explained. "If your wife is there, I might be able to find her." Daniel wrote a letter that night by candlelight, pouring his heart onto the page. He told Aiko about his journey, about his determination to bring her home, about his love, deeper now than ever before. "I made a promise to you," he wrote. "I intend to keep it." He sealed the letter and gave it to Clara. "Please," he said, "make sure she knows she's not alone." 2 days passed with no word. Daniel's money was nearly gone. He helped at the mission to earn his keep, fixing the leaky roof, chopping wood for the stoves. On the third day, Clara returned. Her face was flushed with excitement. "I found her," she said. "She's working in the laundry. I gave her your letter." Daniel's heart leaped. "Is she all right? What did she say?" Clara smiled and handed him something small and white. She couldn't write back. They don't allow it. But she made this. In Daniel's palm lay a tiny paper crane, folded from a scrap of hospital linen. Carefully, he unfolded it. Inside, written in small, neat letters, were 3 words. "I already did." Daniel stared at the message, confusion giving way to understanding. She was answering his promise to marry her properly when this was over. "I already did." She had given her heart to him long ago, in that makeshift chapel in the camp. No government paper could change that. Daniel carefully refolded the crane and tucked it into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. Now he knew what he had to do. The immigration hearing was scheduled for the following week at the Los Angeles courthouse. Daniel arrived early, wearing the only clean shirt he had left, his hair freshly cut by Sister Maria. The courtroom was small and stuffy. A stern-faced judge sat behind a high desk. Army officers and immigration officials filled the front row. Daniel sat alone in the back, his hands clenched together, praying silently. When they brought Aiko in, his breath caught. She looked thinner, her face pale, but her eyes were clear and steady. She saw him and straightened her shoulders, a hint of a smile touching her lips. The hearing began with formal statements. An immigration officer read the charges: falsification of military documents, misrepresentation of marital status, violation of wartime protocols regarding enemy nationals. Then it was Daniel's turn to speak. He stood, feeling all eyes on him. His throat was dry, but his voice came out clear and strong. "Yes, I falsified those first papers," he admitted. "I told a lie to save a life. Aiko was going to be transferred north for interrogation. We all knew what that meant. I couldn't let it happen." He told the story of their time in the camp, how Aiko had tended to sick American soldiers during the cholera outbreak, how she had used her knowledge of herbs to save lives when medicine ran short, how she had shown kindness to enemies and friends alike. "After the war, we came to Kansas," Daniel continued. "She's become part of our community. She's helped neighbors during the drought. She saved a child's life with her remedies." He paused. "She's my wife in every way that matters." The judge's expression remained impassive. "Mr. Hayes, while your story is moving, the law is clear. Marriage obtained through fraudulent means is not valid under United States law." Daniel's hope began to crumble. He looked at Aiko, sitting straight and dignified despite everything. She had survived so much: the camp, the whipping, the journey to America, the hostility of strangers. And now he might lose her because of a lie he told to save her. "Your Honor," he said, his voice breaking, "if loving her is a crime, then I'm guilty. But sending her away won't change that love. It won't make America safer. It will only break 2 hearts." The judge made a note on his pad. "Is there anyone else who wishes to speak in this matter?" The courtroom was silent. Then the back door opened with a creak. All heads turned. Reverend Holt walked down the aisle, his Sunday suit dusty from travel, his Bible clutched in his hand. "I'd like to speak, Your Honor," he said in his deep preacher's voice, "if the court permits." Daniel stared in shock. The Reverend had traveled all the way from Kansas? Why? The judge nodded. "State your name and relationship to the parties." "Reverend Thomas Holt," the man said. I'm the pastor of Grace Church in Topeka County, Kansas. Daniel Hayes and his wife attend my church. The judge raised an eyebrow. And you've traveled all this way to testify? Yes, sir, Reverend Holt said. Because there's something this court needs to know. The courtroom fell silent as Reverend Holt began to speak. He told of Aiko's arrival in their community, of the initial fear and suspicion, of the drought that had nearly destroyed their farms. This woman, he said, pointing to Aiko, saved my child's life when the doctor had given up hope. She shared water from her well when others had none to spare. She taught our women how to preserve food in ways we never knew. He opened his Bible. Scripture tells us, "By their fruits ye shall know them." I have seen the fruits of this marriage, Your Honor. I have seen love turn fear into acceptance. I have seen strangers become family. He closed the Bible and looked directly at the judge. If this court separates them, it will be a grave injustice, not just to them, but to all of us who have been blessed by their union. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Daniel felt a lump in his throat. He had never expected this, support from the very man who had once preached against mixing blood. The judge was silent for a long moment, studying his notes. Finally, he looked up. In light of the testimony presented, and considering the exceptional circumstances, this court rules that Aiko Hayes may remain in the United States as the lawful wife of Daniel Hayes. The words took a moment to sink in. Daniel stood frozen, hardly daring to believe what he'd heard. The deportation order is rescinded, the judge continued. Mrs. Hayes, you are free to go home with your husband. A quiet applause rose from the back of the courtroom. Soldiers who had come to support a fellow veteran, nurses who had cared for Aiko, Sister Maria with her hands clasped in prayer. Daniel didn't remember crossing the room. Suddenly, Aiko was in his arms, her tears soaking his shirt, his own eyes blinded by joy. They clung to each other as if they might never let go. Home, Aiko whispered against his chest. We go home now. Outside the courthouse, the California sun shone bright and warm. Reverend Holt shook Daniel's hand, then surprised everyone by embracing Aiko. The train leaves tomorrow morning, he said. I've got tickets for all three of us. Daniel looked at the man in wonder. Why did you come, Reverend? After everything? Holt shook his head. Because I was wrong, son. And when a man's wrong, he ought to make it right. He smiled. Besides, Margaret would have had my hide if I didn't bring you two back for Thanksgiving. As they walked away from the courthouse, Daniel held Aiko's hand tight in his. The paper crane still rested over his heart, a reminder of promises kept and love that had survived against all odds. The road home stretched before them, long but no longer uncertain. The train journey home felt different this time. Instead of fear and uncertainty, Daniel and Aiko traveled with hope in their hearts. The winter landscape passed by their window, mountains dusted with snow, plains stretched out like brown blankets, small towns with smoke curling from chimneys. Reverend Holt sat across from them, reading his Bible or sometimes just watching the scenery. On the second day, as they crossed into Kansas, he cleared his throat. I owe you both an apology, he said, closing his Bible. When you first came to town, Aiko, I didn't welcome you as I should have. No need for sorry, Aiko said softly. It was hard time. That's no excuse, the Reverend insisted. I preached about love on Sundays, then failed to show it on Monday. He looked at Daniel. Your courage taught me something, son. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is open his heart when others close theirs. Daniel nodded, moved by the Reverend's words. Reckon we all learned something this past year. The train whistle blew as they approached Topeka Station. Outside, the first snow of winter was falling, gentle flakes that melted when they touched the ground. Look, Aiko whispered, her face close to the window. Snow like home. Daniel squeezed her hand. It is home. Margaret was waiting at the station, stamping her feet against the cold. When she saw them step off the train, she ran forward, wrapping Aiko in a fierce hug before embracing her brother. I knew you'd bring her back, she said, tears in her eyes. I just knew it. The farm looked different in winter, the fields resting under a thin blanket of frost, the oak tree's branches bare against the sky. But smoke rose from the chimney, and light glowed in the windows. Margaret had hung pine boughs over the door, their sharp scent filling the air. Welcome home, she said as they entered the warm kitchen. That night, as they sat around the table eating Margaret's rabbit stew, Daniel told the whole story, the long journey west, the mission where he stayed, the hearing, and the judge's decision. So it's over? Margaret asked. They won't try to take her away again? It's over, Daniel confirmed. Aiko is legally my wife, and no one can change that. Later, as Daniel and Aiko prepared for bed in their small room, Aiko took Margaret's locket from around her neck. Should I give back? She asked. Now that we are home safe? Daniel shook his head. Maggie wanted you to have it. Your family now, no doubt about it. Aiko ran her thumb over the locket, then carefully opened it to look at the faded photograph inside. Your mother had kind eyes, she said. Like you. Daniel smiled. She would have liked you. She always said a person's heart mattered more than where they came from. That night, they slept soundly for the first time in weeks, the wind singing around the eaves, the farmhouse creaking gently like an old friend welcoming them back. Winter settled over the farm like a heavy quilt. Snow piled in drifts against the barn. Ice formed on the edges of the new well. The days grew short, the nights long and star-filled. Christmas came, bringing with it simple joys. They couldn't afford much, but Margaret hung paper stars from the ceiling, and Aiko made sweet rice cakes from her homeland. Daniel carved a small wooden bird for Aiko and a set of combs for Margaret. On Christmas Eve, neighbors arrived with gifts, jars of preserves, hand-knitted scarves, a ham for their Christmas dinner. The same people who had once whispered behind their backs now sat in their parlor, singing carols as Reverend Holt played the old piano in the corner. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, that saved a wretch like me, they sang, voices rising in the warm room. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Aiko sat beside Daniel, her hand in his, wonder on her face as she listened to the familiar hymn. That's how I feel, she whispered to him. Found. Later, after everyone had gone, Daniel and Aiko stood on the porch, watching the stars. Their breath made clouds in the cold air. First Christmas without war? Aiko said softly. Daniel nodded. First of many. The thought struck them both at the same time. How close they had come to losing each other. How precious this moment was. Daniel pulled Aiko close, grateful beyond words for the miracle of her presence. January brought bitter cold and a letter from California. Clara, the nurse who had helped Daniel at the detention center, wrote that many children there had lost their parents in the war. Some were Japanese American, their families still in internment camps. Others were orphans of American soldiers with nowhere to go. The government doesn't know what to do with them, Clara wrote. They need homes, but few people will take them. Daniel read the letter aloud at breakfast. When he finished, Iko and Margaret exchanged a glance. "We have room," Margaret said slowly. "The old bunkhouse could be fixed up." "Children need family," Iko agreed. "Need place to belong." Daniel looked from his sister to his wife, surprise and pride filling his chest. "You really think we could do it? Take in orphans?" Margaret shrugged. "This house was meant for a family, and Lord knows we've got land enough." That night, Daniel wrote back to Clara. "Send us 2 children to start," he wrote. "We'll make a home for them here." February passed in a blur of preparation. Daniel repaired the bunkhouse, adding a new stove and patching the roof. Margaret sewed curtains and quilts. Iko planted early seeds in boxes by the kitchen window, starting her garden even before the ground thawed. In March, when the first crocuses pushed through the snow, Clara arrived on the afternoon train. With her were 2 children, a 7-year-old Japanese boy named Takeo and a 5-year-old American girl named Emma. Takeo stood straight and solemn, his small hand holding Emma's. The little girl's eyes were wide with fear, her blonde hair tangled from the long journey. "These 2 have been together since the center," Clara explained. "They're like brother and sister now. We couldn't separate them." Daniel knelt before the children. "Welcome to our farm," he said gently. "I'm Daniel. This is my wife Iko and my sister Margaret." Emma hid behind Takeo. The boy bowed slightly, then spoke in careful English. "Thank you for having us, sir." Iko stepped forward and said something in Japanese. Takeo's eyes widened, and he replied rapidly in the same language. "What did you say?" Daniel asked. "I told him this is his home now," Iko explained, and he asked if that was really true. "It is true," Margaret said, her voice firm. "You're both home now." That night, after the children were asleep in their new beds, Iko sat with Daniel on the porch steps. "They are like us," she said, "between 2 worlds, not belonging anywhere." Daniel nodded. "They belong here now, with us." Iko leaned her head against his shoulder. "We make family from broken pieces," she said. "Like my mother's dishes after earthquake. She put gold in cracks. Said broken things can become beautiful again." Daniel thought about that, about broken things becoming beautiful, about mercy filling the cracks of a wounded world. In that moment, he knew what their small refuge should be called. Spring arrived in a rush of green. The fields turned emerald. Wildflowers dotted the pasture. Birds returned to the oak tree, building nests among the fresh leaves. Word spread about the Hayes farm and the orphans they had taken in. In April, a minister from Kansas City brought 3 more children, 2 Japanese and 1 American. In May, a doctor who had served in the Pacific delivered twin boys whose father had died at Iwo Jima. By summer, the bunkhouse was full. Daniel added on 2 more rooms. The children helped in the fields and the garden. They learned to gather eggs, to milk the cow, to fish in the creek that now ran full again. Iko taught them all, American and Japanese alike, to fold paper cranes. "In Japan," she explained, "crane means long life and good luck. If you fold 1,000, your wish comes true." The children hung their colorful creations from the bunkhouse ceiling. At night, the paper birds danced in the breeze from the open windows, casting delicate shadows on the walls. Margaret taught the older ones to read and cipher. She set up a schoolroom in the barn during rainy days, her voice patient as she guided them through letters and numbers. On Sundays, they all went to church together. Daniel, Iko, Margaret, and their growing family of children. They filled an entire pew now, the Japanese children in their best clothes, the American ones with scrubbed faces and combed hair. No one stared anymore. No one whispered. Instead, church ladies brought extra pies to Sunday dinner. Farmers dropped off outgrown clothes and toys. Reverend Holt organized a town effort to build a proper schoolhouse on the Hayes property. "You've started something special here," the Reverend told Daniel as they laid foundation stones. "Something that heals old wounds." In July, Daniel hired a sign painter from town. The man carefully lettered a wooden board that Daniel mounted on the gate at the end of their lane. "Mercy grows here," it read in bold, flowing script. When Takeo asked what it meant, Daniel explained, "Mercy is when you show kindness to someone, even when it's hard." The boy thought about this. "Like when you took in me and Emma, even though I'm Japanese?" "That's right," Daniel said. "And like when Mrs. Peterson brings apple pies even though she lost her son in the war." Takeo nodded solemnly. "Mercy is stronger than hate," he said, with the simple wisdom of a child. Daniel ruffled the boy's hair. "You've got it exactly right, son." Summer faded into a golden autumn. The garden gave a rich harvest. Pumpkins grew fat on the vine. The corn stood tall in the fields, ready for picking. 1 year had passed since Daniel and Aiko's return from California. 1 year of building a new life, of turning strangers into family, of growing mercy in the Kansas soil. On a warm September evening, as the sun began to set, Daniel sat on the porch, whittling a new toy horse for little Emma. From inside the house came the sound of children laughing as Margaret taught them a clapping game. The screen door slapped as Takeo ran out, a piece of paper in his hand. "Look what I made," he said, holding up a carefully drawn map. "It's our farm." Daniel examined the map with appropriate seriousness. Takeo had labeled everything: the house, the barn, the well, the garden, the creek, and the schoolhouse. In one corner, he had drawn a cluster of stick figures holding hands. "That's all of us," the boy explained proudly. "Our family." Daniel smiled. "It's a fine map, Takeo. Finest I've ever seen." The boy hesitated, then asked, "Can I call you Papa?" He glanced toward the garden where Aiko was working. "And can I call Aiko Mama?" Daniel's heart swelled. "I reckon that would make us mighty happy," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Takeo grinned, then ran off to show his map to the other children. Daniel set aside his whittling knife and walked down to the garden. Aiko knelt among the rows of vegetables, her hands deep in the rich soil. She looked up as he approached, pushing a strand of hair from her face. "The carrots are ready," she said. "And the squash. Good year." Daniel nodded, looking out over their land, the fields they had rescued from drought, the home they had filled with children, the life they had built from the ashes of war. "Good year," he agreed. "Best one yet." The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. In the distance, children's voices called to one another as they played a game of tag near the barn. From the house came the smell of fresh bread baking for supper. Takeo ran toward them, stopping near the edge of the garden. "Papa," he called to Daniel. "Reverend Holt is here with more books for school." As the boy ran back to the house, Aiko smiled. "He called you Papa," she said softly. "Asked permission first," Daniel said, pride in his voice. "Wants to call you Mama, too." Aiko's eyes filled with tears of joy. "So we have children after all," she whispered. Daniel helped her to her feet, brushing soil from her skirt. "We have a family," he corrected. "Different than we expected, but no less real." As they walked hand in hand toward the house, Takeo came running back. He stopped before them, his face serious. "I was wondering," he said slowly. "The flowers by the well, they grow so pretty. Why does everything grow so good here?" Daniel looked at Aiko, then back at the boy. A memory flashed in his mind. Aiko kneeling in a secret garden behind a prison camp, planting herbs that would save lives. Daniel kneeling beside her, offering his help instead of his hate. Because once, Daniel said, resting his hand on Takeo's shoulder, someone refused to hate. The boy considered this answer, then nodded as if it made perfect sense. He ran ahead to join the other children, his feet light on the well-worn path. Daniel and Aiko continued toward the house, where lights now glowed in the windows. Behind them, the garden stretched green and abundant, the soil rich with years of care. Aiko began to hum softly, a Japanese lullaby she sang to the younger children at bedtime. Above them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The same stars that had witnessed their first meeting in a prison camp half a world away. The same stars that would watch over their children and their children's children, long after the wounds of war had healed. The breeze carried Aiko's humming across the golden fields. Daniel listened, his heart full. The melody spoke of journeys ended and beginnings found, of strangers becoming family, of hate transformed by love, of mercy growing here. As winter approached again, Daniel added a second story to the farmhouse. More children had come, some from orphanages, some from broken homes, some brought by concerned doctors or ministers or teachers. Each found a place at the long table in the Hayes kitchen. Each had a bed to sleep in and work suited to their abilities. The schoolhouse was finished before the first snow fell. Margaret taught reading, writing, and arithmetic in the mornings. In the afternoons, Daniel taught the boys farming, while Aiko and the local midwife trained the girls in healing arts. On December evenings, they gathered in the parlor. Aiko told stories of Japan, of cherry blossoms and paper lanterns, of festivals where children flew kites shaped like fish. Daniel played his father's old fiddle, the music sweet and slightly off-key. Margaret read aloud from books borrowed from the town library. "It doesn't matter where you come from," she told the children. "What matters is who you become." Word of the Hayes farm spread beyond Kansas. Newspapers wrote about the unusual family, the American soldier and his Japanese wife who had opened their home to orphans of war. Visitors came to see for themselves, often leaving with tears in their eyes and a new understanding in their hearts. Some gave donations, money, for new books, clothes for growing children, seeds for the expanding garden. Others offered their time. Doctors who provided free checkups, carpenters who built new beds, farmers who shared their knowledge of the land. When a fire destroyed the Petersons' barn that winter, it was the Hayes children who arrived first with offers of help. Japanese and American children working side by side, rebuilding what had been lost. Mrs. Peterson, who had once crossed the street to avoid Aiko, now invited her in for tea and asked for her herb remedy for arthritis. "I never thought I'd welcome a Japanese person into my home," she admitted. "Not after losing my Billy in the war." "Grief is hard thing," Aiko said gently. "Makes heart closed." Mrs. Peterson nodded, tears in her eyes. "But seeing those children, seeing what you and Daniel have built here, it's opened something in me I thought was dead." On Christmas Eve, the entire town gathered at the Hayes farm for a celebration. The schoolhouse was decorated with paper chains and pine boughs. A tall tree stood in the corner, adorned with handmade ornaments. The children performed songs in both English and Japanese. Takeo, now appointed as the oldest big brother, led them in a play about peace that he and Emma had written together. As the night drew to a close, Reverend Holt raised his hands for silence. "Before we part, I want us to remember what we've learned this year," he said. "The Hayes family has shown us that mercy isn't just a feeling, it's something we do. something we grow, like the crops in our fields. He turned to Daniel and Iko. You planted seeds of mercy when the soil was still bitter with war. Now look what has grown. Around the room, faces nodded in agreement. Farmers and shopkeepers, children of different races, people who had once been divided by hate, but now stood united in something stronger. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the children were asleep, Daniel stood at the window of their bedroom, looking out at the moonlit farm. Snow covered the fields like a clean page, ready for new stories to be written. Iko joined him, slipping her hand into his. What are you thinking? She asked. I'm thinking about that day in the camp, Daniel said. When I saw you tied to that post, I only meant to give you water. I never imagined that we would find this life, Iko finished for him. Build this family? Daniel nodded. It started with such a small thing, just one moment of kindness. Small things grow, Iko said, looking out at their land. Like seeds. From the children's rooms came the sound of peaceful breathing, of dreams untroubled by war. In the barn, animals shifted in their sleep. The old farmhouse creaked gently, holding its family safe from the winter cold. Daniel kissed Iko's forehead. Mercy grows here, he whispered. And it did, year after year, season after season. It grew in the children who learned to look past differences and see the humanity in each other's eyes. It grew in a community that opened its arms to strangers. It grew in hearts once hardened by grief, now softened by love. It grew from a single act of kindness, a canteen offered to an enemy, a moment of compassion that changed 2 lives and countless more. In the years to come, the Hayes farm would send its children out into the world, doctors and teachers, farmers and ministers, each carrying the seeds of what they had learned, each planting mercy in new soil. And always, at the gate, the sign would remain. Mercy grows here, not just words on wood, but a truth proven by time, that love is stronger than hate, that kindness can heal the deepest wounds, that mercy once planted grows and spreads until the very earth remembers. Until fields once scarred by war bloom with the flowers of peace,